Alright, and we're set for this week's discussion. Alright, let's make sure all my technical such is working. We're going to be talking today about World War I and its effects. We're going to start off with a little bit about its beginning, middle, and end. So, in late June of 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, he was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo, Bosnia. It was an escalation of threats and mobilization orders followed that incident, leading by mid-August to the outbreak of what we know as World War I, which pitted Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, also known as the Central Powers, against Great Britain, France, Russia, and Japan, which is the Allied powers. The Allies were joined after 1917, less than a year towards the end of the war, by the United States, and the 4 years of the Great War, as it is known, saw unprecedented levels of carnage and destruction. There was grueling trench warfare. The introduction of modern weaponry actually started out of this war, which was what we know as tanks, chemical weapons, machine guns, stuff like that. And by the time World War I ended in the defeat of the Central Powers in November of 1918, more than 9 million soldiers had been killed, and 21 million more were wounded. So with 21 million people wounded and 9 million gone, it's an interesting concept. Alright, so to start off today, I have my big packet of notes as always. I'm going to start off with a little did you know. So a little just tidbit of fact of information is that did you know the young Winston Churchill, then he was the first Lord of the British Admiralty, resigned his command after the failed Gallipoli campaign, which we'll get to, in 1916, accepting commission with an infantry battalion in France. So, beginning of World War I. Though tensions had been kind of picking up in Europe, and especially in the troubled Balkan regions for years, and we're talking many before the actual war started, the spark that ignited World War II, the powder keg, was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the nephew of the Emperor Franz Joseph and heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was shot to death along with his wife by Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip on June 28, 1914. Now, there's an interesting story about how he died. They tried blowing up his car several times along his route as he was touring Sarajevo, and it didn't happen. It didn't work. Many different failures. One man was arrested. The Black Hand, as they were known in Serbia, the terrorist organization, they kind of failed. And then Gavrilo Princip went to a shop, and when one failed assassin was caught, they diverted the motorcade, as we would know it now, with the car with the Archduke, and he ended up backing up right where Gavrilo Princip was getting his food for the day, and he shot him. He shot the Archduke and his wife Sophie. So, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie set off a rapid chain of events. As I said, it was a powder keg and a spark, and when it exploded. Austria-Hungary, like many countries around the world at the time, blamed the Serbian government for that attack and hoped to use the incident as justification for settling the questions what they call the Slavic nation, which you might see ties to World War II about the Jewish question, as they called it. Well, Austria-Hungary had technically owned Serbia for a while, and Serbians didn't like the Austria-Hungarians, and they were trying to fight them and gain their own nationalism. Well, as Russia supported Serbia, Austria-Hungary waited to declare war until its leaders received assurances from the German leader, who at this time is Kaiser Wilhelm II, that Germany would support their cause in the event of a Russian intervention, which would likely involve Russia's ally France, and France's ally Great Britain. Before all this happened, the world powers, like today, created treaties and decided we're going to become friends and make an agreement that if this person attacks us, we're going to attack them and so forth. It's a domino effect, as you will. So on July 5th, Kaiser Wilhelm had secretly pledged his support. He gave Austria-Hungary a blank check, so to speak, kind of like Congress gives Johnson during the Vietnam War in our history. He assured that Germany would back the cause of the war. And the dual monarchy then set an ultimatum to Serbia, which really harsh terms about it. It made it almost 100% impossible to accept this. Convinced that Vienna was readying for war, the Serbian government ordered that the Serbian army get ready and appealed to Russia for their own assistance. Now, on July 28th, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. And the peace between Europe's great powers at that point collapsed. Within 1 week, Russia, Belgium, France, and Great Britain and Serbia had lined up against Austria-Hungary, Germany, and World War I began. Now, Germany had a secret alliance with the Ottoman Empire that no one knew about, and that's what drug the Ottoman Empire into this war. And so did the Austro-Hungarians, but it wasn't as strong. So, it's kind of interesting to see how the assassination of one person throws the entirety of Europe, which is the main center of the world at the time. The United States, we're isolationists. We're not even going to get in the war for a while, and we'll get to that point. We're in 1914 right now. And it was just it's one little thing. We always got to pay attention to one little thing, because it can set the tips and the balance of the world off. It can make us go crazy, which isn't really good. So, as I'm sitting here, I'm going to break this down, as I said, into sections. That's kind of just an overview of the beginning. I have to agree with Frank Nordstrom, who is my moderator tonight, so if you have questions, please comment. I love to hear them. If you have comments, just please do it. It's always fun. If you want to join us, let me know. Moderators, panel speakers, we set it up so there's a lot of us speaking. It's really fun. So he said, dumb luck for Gavrilo Princip being able to actually finally assassinate the Archduke. And it was dumb luck, really crazy dumb luck that made it happen. I mean, eating a sandwich and oh my gosh, here he is, this guy I've been trying to kill all day. So we're going to move on to the Western Front of World War I, which we're going to focus on about 1914, 1917 at this point. So, according to an aggressive military strategy that was known as the Schlieffen Plan, named after its creator, obviously, as we know many things, are named after whoever founded or discovered or created it. It was a German field marshal, von Schlieffen, who created it. Germany would begin fighting World War I on two fronts. A very critical move and devastating move later on. They invaded France through Belgium. They would go up through Belgium, hook a curve, and go down and invade through a neutral country. And they would confront the mighty Russia, as it was known, the Russian Empire, in the east. Well, on August 4th, 1914, the German troops under Erich Ludendorff, they crossed the border into Belgium, and in violation of that country's neutrality. In the first battle of World War I, the Germans had fought the very fortified city of Liege, using the most powerful weapons in their arsenal, which were enormous-sized cannons at the time. And they captured the city by August 15th. 11 days, and they had one of the heaviest and most fortified cities, and it was the first battle in World War I. Now, they left death and destruction in their wake of a neutral country, and including the shooting of civilians and deliberate execution of a Belgian priest, who they accused of inciting civilian resistance. And the Germans advanced through Belgium towards France, went through that crutch. Now, in the First Battle of the Marne, fought from September 6th to 9th in 1914, we just had the anniversary of it, French and British forces confronted the invading German army, which had then penetrated deep into northeastern France, very deep. They were within 30 miles of Paris at the time. Now, Joseph Joffre, who was the French commander, the Allied troops checked the German advance and mounted a successful counterattack. They drove the Germans back north of the Seine River, and This defeat meant that the German plans for a quick victory in France was over. It defeated it very easily, very big. Now, both sides dug into trenches throughout the entire war, and then they began the bloody war of attrition that would characterize the next 3 years of World War I's Western Front. Now, particularly long and costly battles in this campaign were fought at Verdun and Somme. The Battle of the Somme, the trenches of the Somme, you hear a lot of people talk about. One of my favorite authors, J.R.R. Tolkien, actually fought in the trenches of the Somme. So, a little tidbit of history again. Verdun was fought from February to December of 1916, and the Somme from July to November. Now, German and French troops both suffered close to 1 million casualties at the Battle of Verdun alone. Now, trench warfare was not like anything else I've seen. Trench warfare was first introduced actually in the Civil War in the United States, but it wasn't heavily used as it was here. Essentially, these are the Germans and these are the French. They would advance, take over these trenches, they'd build a new one. French would come back, take it over, and build it. Essentially, it became a stalemate. They just kept fighting over the same plot of land. They just keep fighting and fighting and fighting and come back essentially in the same spot. Now, there is a story. Every Christmas during this war, it was very interesting because these countries were still, they were cousins. All the leaders of the countries, all the monarchs were related. They're all cousins somehow, either through Maria Theresa from Austria, who is known as the mother-in-law of Europe, or through Queen Victoria of England, who was the grandmama of Europe. So, between the two, everyone was a cousin fighting each other, so they had a sense of family between them. And with this sense of family, on Christmas, Germans, French, English, they would meet in the middle of the battlefield and exchange gifts and not fire. On the Western Front. Eastern Front's a whole different situation. So now we're going to go over to an overview of the Eastern Front of World War I with the Russians and the revolution in Russia from 1917. So, on the Eastern Front, Russian forces began by invading East Prussia and German Poland. They were stopped really short by German and Austrian forces at the Battle of Tannenberg in late August 1914. Less than a month of the war, they were already stopped. So despite that victory, the Red Army assault had forced Germany to move 2 corps from the Western Front to the Eastern Front to compensate for the German losses in the Battle of the Marne. Combined with the fierce Allied resistance in France, the ability of Russia's huge war machine to mobilize relatively quickly, believe it or not, in the East ensured a very long, grueling conflict instead of the quick victory, once again, that the Germans had hoped to win with the Schieffelin Plan. Over the next 2 years, the Russian army mounted several offensives on the Eastern Front, but were unable to break through those German lines. Once again, it was another stalemate. They fought, and they got stuck. Defeat on the battlefield fed the growing discontent among the bulk of the Russian population, who already was poverty-stricken. They really didn't like the Tsar and his family. They were rich and pretty and did what they wanted, and there was already a lot of discontent, especially among the serfs at the time. They really didn't like this quote-unquote imperial regime. Now, the discontent culminated with the Russian Revolution of 1917. It was spearheaded by a man we know as Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Now, who was Vladimir Lenin? Vladimir Lenin, as we know him now, was not his real name. He was actually born Vladimir Ilyich Yovanov. He was a Russian communist, as we know him now, and political theorist, but he was actually a Bolshevik, was the original title, and the original party system they had. We know he was born in 1870 in Simbirsk in the Russian Empire, and then he died in Gorky of the Moscow Oblast in the Russian Soviet Union. He was someone who could turn a phrase. Much like we'll see with Hitler later on in history, he was someone who could rally the troops and get people around his stance by just speaking. Wasn't anyone important. He was just a normal person, And it kind of was drawing to see him do that. He was able just to get a lot of things to happen, which a lot of people at the time didn't do. Political theorists weren't really liked. So, I talked a little in the beginning about the Gallipoli campaign and why its devastation happened and what happened when Churchill resigned his commission and joined a new commission. Sorry, getting my notes here. Here we go. So, with World War I having effectively settled into a stalemate, like I said, in Europe, the Allies attempted to score a victory against the Ottoman Empire, which had entered the conflict on the side of the Central Powers in late 1914. Like I said, the secret deal with the Germans. After a failed attack on the Dardanelles, which is the strait linking the Sea of Marmara and the Aegean Sea, the Allied forces, which were led by the British, launched a large-scale land invasion of Gallipoli, which is a peninsula in that area, in April 1915. The invasion also proved a dismal failure, a horrible failure. And in January 1916, Allied forces were forced to stage a full retreat from the shores of the peninsula after suffering over 250,000 casualties. It may not seem like a lot of people, but when you stage a quick and easy defeat, quick and easy victory, it becomes a huge defeat when you lose anybody. So the British-led forces also combated the Turks themselves in Egypt and Mesopotamia. If anyone's ever heard of the Lawrence of Arabia, at this time they're also fighting the Ottoman Empire for control of Israel, Jordan, the Sinai Peninsula, Egypt, all the Mesopotamian areas, Syria, all that. Iraq, Iran, all that. While northern Italy, Australian and Italian forces at the same time, they faced off in a series of about 12 major battles along the Isonzo River. It was located at the border between the two nations. That was their natural border. The first battle took place in late April, early May, kind of late springtime of 1950, and soon after Italy's entrance into the war, they switched sides. Italy entered the war on the Central Powers, switched sides, said, no, we're not going to fight them anymore, we're going to be, and that's when they attacked Austria-Hungary, we're going to be on the Allies, which was very interesting. We'll see that happen again in World War II, where Italy switches sides. I think Italy bets, the way I see it, is they start on one side, oh, we're losing, okay, switch sides, and we're going to win. It becomes very interesting. In the 12th battle, however, or the Battle of Caporito, which was in October 1917, the German reinforcements helped Austria-Hungary win a very, very decisive victory. After Cupertino, Italy's allies jumped in to offer its increased assistance finally. British and French, and then later American troops arrived in the region, and the allies began to take back the initiative on the Italian front. So it's been commented about trench warfare, that it was made popular, and it was the grinder. The reason it was called the grinder was there were a lot of machine guns, tanks, well, later tanks, as well as there ended up being a lot of shelling, where, you're shooting mortars at each other. And when that happened, people were just blowing up into pieces, and then the chemical warfare, bodies everywhere, and still blowing up and getting corrupt. It was a disgusting, disgusting point in our history, in human history. So, we've gone over some of the major battles. Let's talk about the battle at sea, because no war is ever fought just between land. There's always some sort of sea battle. So after the Battle of Dogger Bank, which was in January 1915, the German Navy chose not to confront Britain's Royal Navy in a major battle for over a year. The reason this being is the reason this is because the Royal Navy was the mightiest in the world. It had been since Queen Elizabeth I's time, which was in the 1500s with Sir Francis Drake in the decisive battle against the Spanish Armada. That's when it was recognized that it was the power of the seas. You know, "Oh Britannia, Britannia rules the waves" is within their main songs and historical themes. Alright, get back to my notes here. So, after the rest of the bulk of its strategy at sea, they decided to use their U-boat submarines, which they were submarines, but Unterseebooten, essentially, a submarine. They decided to just use unrestricted warfare, which is where they would attack any ship, merchant, or cruise liner, anything that's flying an Allied flag, including, obviously, destroyers and carriers. The biggest naval engagement of World War I was the Battle of the Jutland, which was in May of 1916. It left the British naval superiority on the North Sea intact, and Germany would make no further attempts to break the Allied naval blockade for the rest of the war. They gave up after that. It was Germany's policy, as I had said, for unchecked submarine aggression against shipping interests headed to Great Britain, and it helped bring the United States into World War I in 1917. Widespread protest over the sinking by U-boat of the British ocean liner of the Lusitania in May of 1915 helped turn the tide of the American public opinion against Germany. The reason this was there were 129 Americans who were killed and were on this ocean liner. Now, we still have speculation about the Lusitania, and people believe that it carried weapons and that it was, actually bringing over advanced weaponry to Great Britain against America's isolationism without Congress's approval. But we will never know. Robert Ballard actually found the Lusitania just as he found the Titanic, and they've explored and found no evidence. So, in February 1917, the United States Congress passed a $250 million arms appropriations bill, which may not seem like a lot, but back in 1917, $250 million was equivalent of about $5 to $6 trillion today. It was intended to make the United States ready for war in case we need to. Germany sunk 4 more U.S. merchant ships themselves the following month, and on April 2nd, President Woodrow Wilson appeared before Congress and called for a declaration of war only against one country, and that country is Germany. So, as it's been mentioned by Mr. Nordstrom, there's a theme for World War I. Rivers and river basins make the basis for many points of battle. Rivers were decisive. Whoever controlled the water could control their army. No food, no water, no one's going to be fighting. So with this food and water controlling the river, you could grow food easier. You could bathe quicker. You could filter out water. People could be less thirsty. You could rinse down equipment, clean things, so forth. It was very decisive. Plus, it was a lot of borders were made up of the rivers because they're a natural border. Even today, the Danube River, you can see Serbia on one side, Austria on the other, and then Serbia on one side, Croatia on the other, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia. It's really just interesting to see that. And it still continues to this day to be the Serbian-Croatian War and the Yugoslavian civil wars and so forth. They were fighting each other, the Balkan Wars. And the river was the point. So, with Germany, okay, we're going to move over towards an armistice of the end of 1917 to 18. Like I said, we're in the review process still. So, with Germany able to build up its strength on the Western Front after the armistice with Russia, which we'll get into, Allied troops struggled to hold off another German offensive until promised reinforcements from the United States were able to arrive. On July 15, 1918, the German troops, under the same guy, Erich von Lunderhoff, launched what would become the last offensive of the war. They attacked French forces, joined by about 85,000 American troops, as well as some British, in the Second Battle of the Marne. Partly thanks to strategic planning, and the Allies put the German offensive back, launched their own counteroffensive just 3 days later. The French commander-in-chief, Philippe Pétain, kind of knew what he was doing, but he just kind of guessed. So it was a little bit of luck and a little bit of strategic planning. After the major casualties that came out of this battle, how do I say this? The German offensive further north, like in the Flanders region, stretching between France and Belgium, which had envisioned as Germany's best hope of victory, was called off. They had a plan to retake it, and it didn't work at all. After they lost so many people, they had to send more people to the Western Front and more people to confront France that there was no way they were going to go through Belgium again and conquer half of it. So the Second Battle of the Marne turned the tide of the war decisively towards the Allies, who were able to regain so much of France and Belgium in the months that followed that. By fall of the 1918, the Central Powers were they're unraveling on all their fronts. Besides the Turkish victory at Gallipoli, later defeats by invading forces, and an Arab revolt against them, it had kind of destroyed the Ottoman Empire from the inside out, devastated its economy, the land was scorched, and the Turks signed a treaty with the Allies in late October 1918, taking them out of the war. Austria-Hungary was dissolving from within due to growing nationalist movements among its crazily diverse population, and it reached an armistice on November 4th. Facing the dwindling of resources on the battlefield, discontent on the home front, and the surrender of its allies, Germany was finally forced to seek an armistice on what we know now in the United States as Veterans Day, which used to be Armistice Day, on November 11th, 1918, which ended World War I. It was signed in a boxcar on 11/11 at 11/11. So that's why 11/11 becomes important. That armistice, I actually have a newspaper in my collection. I have a German newspaper, a French, an English, and an American newspaper speaking about... It told about the armistice starting, and it's just something interesting to read and see. At the time of this armistice, the people to blame were Austria-Hungary and Russia. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia declared war on Austria-Hungary. We'll see that changes when we get to the Treaty of Versailles. So, just its kind of legacy that it left behind. World War I took the life of more than 9 million soldiers, which is insane. And 21 million more were wounded somehow. Civilian casualties caused indirectly by the war numbered close to 10 million themselves. And the two nations most affected were Germany and France, each of which had sent about 80% of their male populations between the ages of 15 and 49 into battle. The war also marked the fall of 4 imperial dynasties: Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Turkey. No longer imperial at the end of this war. Now, at the peace conference in 1919, where the Treaty of Versailles was in Versailles, Paris, right outside Paris, Allied leaders would state that they desired to build a post-war world that would safeguard itself against these future conflicts, such as a devastating scale. This was the World War I for a reason. It was the first war where the major powers came against each other. It was the war to end all wars. That's what it was known as. The Versailles Treaty was signed on June 28th in 1919, and it would not achieve this objective. Sadly, war guilt and heavy reparations and denied entrance into the League of Nations themselves, which is the precursor to what we know as the United Nations today, Germany was tricked into signing the treaty, and having believed any peace would be a peace without victory, as put forth by Wilson himself in his 14 points speech in January of 1918. As the years passed, hatred of the Versailles Treaty and its authors settled into a huge resentment in Germany, and 2 decades later would be counted as a major cause it was a major cause of World War II later on, 2 decades later. Now, yes, I will get you there, Dad Nordstrom. So, please share the video. Let people know. This is going live right now on Ustream, Facebook Live, YouTube Live, iLive. As well, it's going to be on our YouTube page here in a little while. I'll download it after we're done tonight. We've only been talking for a little bit. I have some more things to go over, which is kind of... We've been known to go an hour with the last few speeches. So... a question was asked was that I'm saying it was a numbers game of people's lives that ended the war. I'm saying it was both the end of the war with numbers with people's lives and resources. Resources was a huge thing. People, Germany especially, did not have the resources to keep going without its allies. No more shipping lanes. If they couldn't provide food for their people, they weren't going to be able to fight any longer, and they were already having trouble providing weapons, foods, ammunition, just basic necessities as well. So, pulling up my notes here for the more in-depth speaking. So, we're going to talk a little bit about the Russian Revolution and how it worked with World War I. So, the Russian Revolution. In 1917, two revolutions had swept through Russia, ending centuries of imperial rule and setting in motion political and social changes. This is what would lead to the formation of what we know as the former USSR, the Soviet Union, and it just kind of led to what we now have as the Russian Federation. In March, growing civil unrest coupled with the chronic food shortages erupted into an open revolt, which forced the abdication of the Tsar Nicholas II. He was the last Russian Tsar. Just months later, the newly installed provisional government was overthrown by the more radical Bolsheviks, who were led by Vladimir Lenin. So, in 1917, most of the Russians had lost their faith in the leadership ability of Tsar Nicholas II. The government corruption was rampant, the Russian economy remained backward, and the Tsar repeatedly dissolved the Duma, which was the Russian parliament established after the 1905 revolution, when it opposed his will. However, the immediate cause of the February Revolution, which was the first phase of the Russian Revolution of 1917, was Russia's disastrous involvement in World War I. Militarily, Imperial Russia was no match for the industrialized Germany at the time. Russia was still agrarian, not really industrialized, and they had problems. The Russian casualties were greater than those sustained by any other nation in any previous war as well. And the economy was hopelessly disrupted by the costly war effort. And moderates had joined Russian radical elements in calling for the overthrow of the Tsar. Little bit more tidbit of did you know facts. Tsar Nicholas II and his family, they were executed by the Bolshevik forces in July of 1918. The killers hid the victims' mutilated bodies. They were discovered and exhumed actually in 1970s near Ekaterinburg in Russia, and they were eventually identified through their DNA testing. So, the February Revolution of 1917. It was known as such because of Russia's use of the Julian calendar until February 1918. It began on March 8, 1917, or February 23rd on the Julian calendar. It demonstrated the clamoring for bread took to the streets in the Russian capital of Petrograd, which we know now as St. Petersburg. Supported by huge crowds of striking industrial workers, the protesters clashed with police, but refused to leave the streets. On March 10th, the strike spread among all of Petrograd's workers, and irate mobs destroyed police stations. Several factories elected deputies to the Petrograd Soviet or Council Workers Committees, and following the model devised on the 1905 revolution. Now, on March 11th, the troops of Petrograd Army Garrison were called out to stop the uprising, quash it, get it done. In some encounters, regiments actually opened fire and killed demonstrators. But the protesters kept to the streets, and the troops began to actually waver and falter. That day, Tsar Nicholas II again dissolved the Duma. And on March 12th, the revolution triumphed when regiment after regiment of the Petrograd garrison defected to the cause. They said, we're no longer going to fight for the Tsar, we're going to fight for the people. And the soldiers subsequently formed committees that elected deputies to the Petrograd Soviet. Now, the imperial government was forced to resign, and the Duma formed a provisional government that peacefully vied with the Petrograd Soviet for control of the revolution. On March 14th, the Soviet issued Order Number 1, which instructed Russian soldiers and sailors to obey only those orders that did not conflict with the directives of the Soviet. The next day, on March 15th, Tsar Nicholas II officially abdicated his throne in favor of his brother Michael, whose refusal of the crown brought an end to the aristocrat era, of czars. In the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, the power was shared between the weak provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet. On November 6th and 7th of 1917, or October 24th and 25th of the Julian calendar, which is why this event is also referred to as the October Revolution, even though in our calendar it's November. The leftist revolutionaries were led by the Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin. They launched nearly bloodless coup, a coup d'etat or coup, against the provisional government, which was led by Alexander Kerensky. Now, the Bolsheviks and their allies occupied many government buildings and other strategic locations throughout Petrograd, and they soon formed a new government with Lenin as the chairman. Lenin became the virtual dictator of the first Marxist state in the world. His government made peace with Germany. They nationalized their industry and distributed land. But beginning in 1918, they had to fight a devastating civil war against the anti-Bolsheviks, who were known as the White Armies. In 1920, however, the anti-Bolsheviks were defeated, and in 1922, the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, which is the USSR or Soviet Union, was officially established. So what took Russia out of the war was its own internal unrest, and World War I kind of became... The tides ever turned. Germany was no longer fighting a two-front war, they were fighting a one-front war, and just had to deal with the West. Which is fine. I mean, it could always be worse. Now, once again, if you guys want to share this, please do let anybody know. There's college students, high school students, a bunch of people who would want to know this stuff. I not only research my own things, I do a lot of research between a lot of different sources, and we try and get as much done in a couple days as possible. Now, we're going to talk about why Germany was wrongly blamed for the war. People talk about World War I being the way to stop Germany from enslaving all of Europe. But it really didn't. There's a really good article on Slate.com, which is a really good news source. They talk about a lot of historical things. It was on the 100th anniversary of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The German responsibility, how do I say this? You should read a book called All Quiet on the Western Front, which is a very interesting book. But Germany was blamed for the war because they were the strongest out of the Central Powers. Ottoman Empire had fallen. Austria-Hungary had fallen. Italy had switched sides. So there was only one country to blame that was still fighting and had to end on an armistice. That was Germany. Every other major country, and those that weren't involved, were invited to the peace conference at Versailles in Paris. And Germany was not. They were told you have to wait until the end to come in. And they came within the last 3 days and were forced into signing the treaty. Now, the Treaty of Versailles had a lot of problems within it. Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States at the time, had set out with 14 points to go on to and get out of the peace conference, he only got one of those, which was the last point and the last thing in the Treaty of Versailles, which was the creation of the League of Nations. So, of the many, many provisions, one of the most important and controversial required that Germany had to accept the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage during the war. The other members signed treaties containing similar articles, but not what we know as the War Guilt Clause, which left it more on Germany. The treaty forced Germany to disarm. They made substantial territorial concessions, lost a lot of their territory, and they had to pay reparations to certain countries that had formed, which we had called the Entente powers, the Allies. In 1921, the total cost of those reparations was assessed at 132 billion marks, which would have been about 31.4 billion American dollars, which was roughly equivalent to nowadays of $442 billion. At the time, the economists had, notably Mr. Keynes, had predicted that treaty was too harsh and a Carthaginian peace. If you'd ever known about the Battle of Carthage with Rome and Caesar and so forth. Many battles of Carthage in northern Africa. And they had said that the reparations figure was excessive and it was counterproductive. They viewed that it had been the subject of ongoing debate still today by historians and economists from several countries. Now, on the other hand, prominent figures on the Allied side, such as the French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, criticized the treaty for treating Germany too leniently. They were too nice to it. And the result of these competing and sometimes conflicting goals among the victors was a compromise that left no one content. Germany was neither pacified nor consolidated, nor was it permanently weakened. The problems that arose from the treaty would lead to the Locarno treaties, which improved the relations between Germany and other European powers. And the renegotiation of the reparation system resulted in the Dawes Plan, the Young Plan, and the indefinite postponement of reparations according to the Lausanne Conference of 1932. And although it was referred as the Versailles Conference, only the actual signing of the treaty took place at the palace. Most of the negotiations were actually in Paris. Now, the only countries that signed the actual document were Germany, the United States, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. This treaty is what we hear a lot of rhetoric about later on within the next decade or two from what is known as the National Socialist Workmen's Party in Germany. Now, the National Socialist Workmen's Party was just a little far left of center, but sometimes far right. It depended on which way they did. It was abbreviated NSDAP, but what we came to be known in English as the Nazi Party. It was a political party that became very active between 1920 and 1945, and it practiced the idea of Nazism. Now, its precursor was just the German Workmen's Party, and they started in 1919, like I said, and they created themselves into the National Socialist German Workmen's Party. It had a lot of chairmen and different people in charge, and they kind of blamed the Jews for the treaty, the rest of the Allied powers, as well as they blamed the German leaders for conceding to the powers of the rest of Europe. This is who would lead to this would lead to such leaders as Adolf Hitler, Adolf Eichmann, Himmler. It would also lead to Martin Bormann, Anton Drexler, and many people that we know who have started World War II. And not only did Hitler, a lot of people think it was just about the Jews, he blamed the devastation of the German economy, which was in ruins because of all these reparations that were put on them after the end of World War I, it attributed. World War I is a direct precursor to World War II. They are connected. Anyone who tells you different either does not study history, does not know history, or is trying to sell you something, because there's no truth to that. with World War I's ending, it took a lot for Americans to enter the war. Like I had said, we had to just... A lot of civilians had to die before we decided to actually enter the war. Lots of freighters, lots of merchant ships, lots of cruise liners. When the Americans came in, we were so young. We were 17, 18-year-olds and down to 15-year-olds. I think the oldest normal infantryman was about, I want to say about 25. They referred to the Americans as doughboys because we were so young. And we were just into the war. We were in the war for less than a year. April 1917. I mean, or just over a year, excuse me. April 1917 to November 1918. It affected everything. There's a lot of social trauma. The optimism of La Belle Epoque, which was how to live life, be beautiful, we can do this together. It was completely destroyed by all this. World War I is something that we should have never seen repeated. The first tentative effects to comprehend the meaning and consequences of modern warfare began during the initial phases of the war. This process continued throughout and after the end of hostilities, and it's still underway today more than a century later. Wilfred Owen wrote a book, Strange Meeting, in 1918. This is where we're going to end after I answer questions at the end. It said, "Strange friend," I said, "here is no cause to mourn." "None," said the other, "save the undone years." So, last question asked. Pull it up here. It says, German command have openly blamed Jewish money establishments and lack of resources diverted by Jews kept German generals from realizing the victories, rise of nationalism, even in defeat. It's very true. Germans, especially German High Command, had blamed the Jews and their banking systems due to stereotypes and racist remarks that Jews own all the money and control all the money. That it kept the German generals from getting their victories by holding the money, not giving it to them when they needed to purchase tanks, machine guns, more chlorine gas, essentially. Now, World War I also saw, I didn't talk about the dogfights, the first airplanes and air warfare, because there are only so many dogfights, and yeah, there's the story of the Red Baron, but it's really not romanticized as it is in modern popular culture. But there are some things I'm going to talk about to end this today. We're going to talk about the firsts that came out of World War I. World War I created a lot of firsts for the world. The first tanks were used in this war. Tanks were a concept. They were actually known by a very big, really crazy name. The reason they were known as tanks is when they were being shipped from the United States to Britain or Britain to France, when they'd get stopped, because they were shipped on secret vessels, ocean liners, they wrote water tank, gas tank, tank on the box. We saw the first flamethrowers. The first use of steel helmets was used. As I was saying, the tanks. Now, the British Army had about 2,636 tanks. The French had about 3,870. And the U.S. had less than 100 tanks. The Germans had a total of 20 tanks throughout the war. We saw the first fleets of fighting aircraft, the dogfights. We saw the first aircraft carriers. Boats were converted to be able to launch airplanes. World War I also gave us some other things. Gave us the first chemical warfare. That had led to the first gas masks being created. And they also gave us the first guide dogs because of that. As well, the first x-ray machines. There was the first established blood bank and the first enlisted woman, which gave way to the Navy's yeomanettes. And the first time American soldiers actually were ever given an IQ test. It also created the first presidential trip to Europe, which was Woodrow Wilson's attendance at the peace conference. And World War I was the first and only war in history to ever be commonly called the war to end all wars. This war did not end wars. Two decades later, World War II. started by the birth of the Jewish question, aka the Holocaust, yes. And then it created to today. We're still in different conflicts. Later on the road, we have Korean War, Vietnam War, wars throughout countries today that are civil warring. In Darfur region, in the Middle East, we have conflicts. War is something we should never have to do, and never have to revert to. Unfortunately, it's a human way of life, and we need to think about a real war to end all wars, which in today's world is nuclear war. Once it's nuclear war, we're done. No one will be here to pick up the pieces. So, with that, that's the end of tonight's discussion. Are there any more questions or comments from anyone in the audience? I know Rick Nordstrom's down there commenting a lot today and last week, kind of the only one. I'm spewing a lot of info at you, but I'm sure you'll be able to handle it. World War I was devastating, but it brought us a lot of firsts. So, with that, thank you for tuning in. This will be on our YouTube channel. Share it. Watch us on YouTube. Subscribe to us. Add us. I was supposed to have a friend on here this week. Unfortunately, he had class tonight, so we're going to try and go to another night with him. Next week, I do not know what day. Check the website for the tentative schedule, and I'll be posting what topics we want to be discussing about next week. If you have any suggestions, email me, text me, Facebook me, something. I'll see you next week. Have a great time.